At 6:23 a.m. on February 18, 1966, Sergeant Michael Torres crouched behind a fallen teak tree 3 kilometers west of Chu Lai, watching his point man, Private First Class David Chen, move through waist-high elephant grass with the kind of careful precision that kept men alive in the jungle. The morning mist hung thick and white between the trees. They'd been on patrol for 4 hours. No contact, no movement. Just the suffocating humidity and the constant awareness that every step could be your last. Chen stopped. His hand went up. Fist closed. Danger! Torres felt his stomach drop. In the next 30 seconds, Chen would discover what 300 men in the 196th Light Infantry Brigade had learned in the past 2 months. The jungle itself had become the enemy, and the weapon that would redefine American tactics in Vietnam wasn't made of steel or explosives. It was sharpened bamboo, human ingenuity, and a farmer's intimate knowledge of the land he was defending. The trap that waited 15 feet ahead of Chen wasn't in any manual. It wasn't supposed to exist. By all accounts, it should have been impossible to hide something that deadly in terrain U.S. forces had swept twice in the last week. But Nguyen Van Thanh had built it anyway, and he'd built it so well that even veteran jungle fighters couldn't see it until it was too late. The official U.S. Army Field Manual listed 17 approved methods for detecting and neutralizing booby traps. What it didn't list was how to fight an enemy who could turn a peaceful forest path into a minefield using nothing but bamboo stakes, rope made from vines, and patience measured in days. Battalion intelligence had documented 47 different trap variations in the Aba Corps tactical zone. They'd photographed them, cataloged them, warned every unit moving through the province. But knowing about the traps and surviving them were 2 entirely different things. Torres had watched 3 men die to booby traps in the last month. Corporal James Wilson on January 22nd, a punji pit that opened beneath him like the earth itself wanted him dead. Private Luis Rodriguez on February 3rd, a bamboo whip that swung out of nowhere and drove 6-inch spikes through his chest. Specialist Thomas Kowalski on February 9th, a tiger trap that dropped a spiked plank onto his head from above. Each death had been quick, each death had been brutal, and each death had left the survivors looking at every shadow, every vine, every square foot of jungle floor with increasing paranoia. Chen took another step forward. The grass moved around his boots. Torres could see him testing the ground with his rifle barrel, probing for the thin mats of woven grass that usually covered the pits. Standard procedure, smart, but not enough, because the man who'd built the trap waiting ahead had studied how Americans moved. He'd watched their patterns, he'd learned their caution, and he'd designed his trap to defeat exactly the kind of careful searching Chen was doing. Nguyen Van Thanh was 24 years old, born in a village that no longer existed, fighting a war that had consumed his entire adult life. Before the Americans came in force in 1965, he'd been a rice farmer. His hands knew the feel of seedlings and water buffalo more than they knew weapons. But war changes everyone, and Thanh had discovered he possessed a talent, not for shooting, not for the direct confrontations that got men killed quickly in this war, but for patience, for planning, for understanding that in guerrilla warfare the best weapon was the one your enemy never saw coming. He'd learned the basics from his father, who'd learned them from his father, who'd fought the French in the First Indochina War. The principles hadn't changed in 20 years. Bamboo was everywhere in the jungle. It grew fast. It was strong. and when sharpened and fire-hardened, it could pierce boot leather, flesh, and bone with terrifying ease. The punji stake had been used in Vietnam for centuries. Chinese invaders had died on them in the 1400s. The Mongols before that. Now Americans were learning the same lessons their predecessors had paid for in blood. But Thanh wasn't satisfied with the traditional designs. The simple pit trap worked, but it was predictable. Americans had learned to spot the telltale signs: disturbed earth, unnatural clearings, grass that looked too carefully arranged. So Thanh innovated. He spent nights in the jungle studying how Americans patrolled. He watched them probe the ground ahead. He saw how they marked suspicious areas. He learned their rhythms. And then he built traps that exploited every gap in their defenses. The trap that waited for Chen was Than's masterpiece. It had taken him 3 days to build. The pit itself was 5 feet deep, 3 feet wide, carefully dug during the night while American artillery rumbled in the distance. The sides were lined with bamboo stakes, not vertical like the traditional design, but angled downward at 30 degrees. Once your leg went in, the stakes made it impossible to pull it out without tearing your own flesh apart. But the real innovation was above. Thanh had woven the covering mat not from grass, but from living plants. He'd carefully bent and intertwined the elephant grass that grew naturally in the area, creating a surface that looked identical to the surrounding terrain because it was the surrounding terrain. No seams, no breaks, no artificial edges. The mat would hold a man's weight for exactly 2 steps. On the 3rd step, as weight transferred forward, the center would give way. By the time you realized you were falling, it was already too late. But even that wasn't enough for Thanh. He'd added a final touch that marked him as either a genius or a monster, depending on which side of the war you stood. Along the stakes at the bottom of the pit, he'd carefully applied a coating. Not the feces that most fighters used, though that was effective enough. Thanh had used sap from a particular tree that grew near his village. The sap caused extreme inflammation and infection. Combined with the humid environment and the difficulty of evacuating wounded men from the jungle, it turned every puncture wound into a potential death sentence. He'd placed the trap at a specific point along the trail, not at an obvious choke point. Americans had learned to avoid those. Instead, he'd put it 30 meters past a small clearing, in the exact spot where point men, relieved to have cleared the open ground, would relax their guard for just a moment. Psychology, timing, understanding human nature. These were Than's real weapons. The morning Chen's patrol entered the area. Thanh was 2 kilometers away, moving supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He wouldn't know if his trap had worked until days later, when the information filtered back through the network of guerrilla fighters that operated in the region. But he'd built it well. He'd built it right. And somewhere in his mind, he knew it would claim another victim. Chen's 3rd step forward landed on the mat. For half a second, everything was normal. The grass held. His boot found what felt like solid ground. He started to transfer his weight. Torres, 20 feet behind, was scanning the tree line to their right. The rest of the patrol, strung out in a line behind them, were focused on their own sectors. Standard tactical spacing, good discipline, none of it mattered. The mat gave way. Chen dropped. His left leg plunged into the pit up to the hip. The bamboo stakes, positioned with mathematical precision, caught his leg from multiple angles. 2 stakes penetrated his thigh. One drove through his calf. Another caught him just above the knee. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming. Chen screamed, a sound Torres would hear in his nightmares for the next 40 years. Torres was moving before his conscious mind registered what had happened. 5 steps forward, dropping to the ground beside the pit. Chen was thrashing, trying to pull his leg free. Each movement drove the stakes deeper. Blood was already pooling at the bottom of the pit. Torres grabbed Chen's shoulders. "Stop moving! Stop! You're making it worse!" The rest of the patrol converged, weapons pointed outward, covering the jungle, because the traps were never alone. Often they were the opening move in an ambush, but this morning the jungle stayed silent. Just Chen's screams and the sound of men trying desperately to figure out how to save him. Doc Wilson, the platoon medic, was there in seconds. He looked at the pit, at the stakes, at the angle they'd entered Chen's leg. His face went pale. "Sergeant, we've got a problem." Torres knew what he meant. The stakes were angled. Pulling Chen straight up would tear his leg apart, but leaving him there wasn't an option, and they were in enemy territory with no immediate support. The nearest landing zone was 2 clicks away through hostile jungle. "Can you sedate him?" Torres asked. "I can try, but we're going to have to cut the stakes to get him out." 20 minutes later, with Chen mercifully unconscious from morphine, they'd managed to remove enough stakes from the pit wall to pull him free. The damage was catastrophic. His left leg was shredded. Bone was visible through torn muscle. The sap Than had applied was already causing massive inflammation. The surrounding tissue looked angry and swollen. They called in a medevac. The Huey arrived 30 minutes later, dropping into a clearing half a click away. 4 men carried Chen on a poncho stretched between rifles. By the time they reached the LZ, his leg was twice its normal size. The infection was spreading faster than anyone had seen before. The pilot took one look and pushed the throttle forward, heading straight for the 312th Evacuation Hospital in Chu Lai. Chen survived, barely. They amputated his leg 3 inches below the hip. The infection had spread so fast that waiting even another hour would have killed him. He was 22 years old, from San Francisco. He'd been in country for 6 months. His war was over, and he was one of the lucky ones. The trap that took Chen was the 48th documented booby trap incident in the 196th Brigade's area of operations in the first 2 months of 1966. It would not be the last. By the end of February, that number would climb to 63, by the end of March to 97. The casualties were mounting, and more troubling than the numbers was the increasing sophistication of the traps. Major Robert Henderson, the brigade intelligence officer, had been tracking the pattern. He'd set up a map in his operations tent with every booby trap incident marked. Red pins for fatalities, yellow pins for injuries. The map was covered in pins, and what worried Henderson most was the clustering. Multiple traps in the same area, each one slightly different, as if someone was experimenting with variations. On February 24th, he called a meeting of company commanders. 12 officers crowded into a tent that smelled like canvas and sweat. Henderson stood beside his map. "Gentlemen, we have a problem. Booby trap casualties are up 47% compared to last quarter. More concerning, the traps are evolving. We're seeing designs we haven't encountered before. Whoever's building these, they're learning faster than we're adapting." Captain James Morrison, Alpha Company, spoke up. "Sir, my men are scared to walk point. Every step could be their last. It's affecting operational effectiveness." Henderson nodded. "I understand, but we can't stop patrolling, so we need to figure out how to counter this. I want to know what you're seeing on the ground." The reports that followed painted a picture of an enemy that was innovative, patient, and intimately familiar with the terrain. Traps placed in psychologically strategic locations, designs that anticipated American countermeasures, secondary traps positioned to catch, soldiers coming to help their wounded comrades. The Viet Cong weren't just setting traps, they were thinking 3 steps ahead. Captain David Chen, no relation to the wounded private, commanded Bravo Company. "Sir, we've started seeing trigger mechanisms we can't figure out. Last week, we found a trap that appeared to be pressure-activated, but when engineers tried to disarm it, they discovered it was actually controlled by a wire buried 6 inches under the trail, connected to an observer position 50 meters away. Command detonated. The complexity is increasing." Henderson updated his map with the new information. "All right, here's what we're going to do. First, I want detailed sketches and photographs of every trap we encounter. We need to understand these designs. Second, I'm requisitioning more mine detectors and probe equipment. Third, we're changing patrol tactics. No more single-file movement through suspected areas. We spread out. And fourth," he paused, "fourth, we need to start thinking like they do." What Henderson didn't know was that his counterpart, a North Vietnamese intelligence officer named Major Pham Van Duc, was conducting similar meetings in a hidden base camp 15 kilometers away. Duke was coordinating the booby trap campaign across 3 provinces. He'd recognized early that traps weren't just weapons. They were force multipliers. Every American soldier worried about traps was a soldier not focused on finding guerrilla fighters. Every unit slowed down by trap-clearing operations was a unit that couldn't respond quickly to other threats. The psychological impact was worth 10 times the actual casualties. Duke had identified Nguyen Van Thanh as one of his best trap builders. Than's designs were elegant, deadly, and remarkably effective. In late February, Duke called Than to his headquarters. The meeting took place in an underground bunker, lit by oil lamps, the air thick with cigarette smoke. "Comrade Than, your work has been noticed," Duke began. "The Americans are losing men to your traps at a rate that exceeds all other fighters in this sector. I want you to train others. Share your techniques. We need to expand this program." Than was uncomfortable with the attention. He wasn't a soldier, not really. He was a farmer who'd learned to fight out of necessity, but he understood the importance of what Duke was asking. "I can teach them," he said quietly, "but they must understand this is not about building traps. It's about understanding the enemy, watching them, learning how they think." Over the next month, Than trained 15 other fighters in his methods. He taught them about sight lines and psychology, about using the environment itself as camouflage, about patience and precision. The training happened at night, in clearings deep in the jungle with sentries posted to warn of American patrols. By the end of March, his students had built and emplaced over 40 traps throughout the region. The American response was equally systematic. Henderson established a booby trap school at the brigade base. Every new unit rotating into the area was required to attend. The school used actual captured traps, reconstructed with careful attention to detail. Instructors, many of them combat engineers who'd survived trap encounters, taught recognition techniques. Sergeant First Class Thomas Riley ran the school. He was 32, on his second tour, and he'd personally disarmed or documented over 70 traps. He knew the subject as well as any American in Vietnam. His opening lecture never changed. "Gentlemen, the Viet Cong are not stupid, they're not primitive, and they're not fighting fair, because this isn't that kind of war. They can't beat us in a straight fight, so they're making us afraid to walk through the jungle. And it's working. Your job is to learn these traps so well that you can spot them before they spot you. The instruction was comprehensive. Students learned about traditional punji pits and how to probe for them. They learned about bamboo whips and the telltale signs of tensioned poles hidden in vegetation. They learned about grenade traps and pressure release mechanisms. They learned about tiger traps and mace traps and the dozen other variations the Viet Cong had developed. But most importantly, they learned to think defensively, to question every step, to trust nothing in the jungle. By April 1966, the 196th Brigade's booby trap casualty rate began to drop. Not dramatically, but measurably. From 15 casualties in March to 11 in April to 8 in May. The training was working. Soldiers were spotting traps before triggering them. Engineers were successfully disarming more devices. The tide was turning. Slightly, but Thanh and his students adapted. When Americans started probing the ground more carefully, they moved traps into trees. When Americans spread out their formations, they built larger trap fields. When Americans used mine detectors, they switched to purely mechanical triggers that didn't show up on electronic sweeps. It became a deadly game of innovation and counter-innovation, played out in the jungle with lives as the stakes. Private First Class Danny Martinez learned this the hard way on May 7th. His unit had successfully cleared a trail section using the new techniques. They'd found 2 traps, marked them, and moved around. Martinez was feeling confident, maybe too confident. He stepped over a log that had fallen across the trail. Standard obstacle avoidance. What he didn't see was the thin wire running from the log to a bamboo whip positioned in the trees above. His boot caught the wire, the whip released. 6 bamboo stakes, each 18 inches long and sharpened to needle points, swung down at over 60 miles per hour. 3 stakes hit Martinez in the upper back and shoulder. 1 penetrated his lung. He was dead before his body hit the ground. The trap that killed Martinez was a variation Thanh had designed specifically to defeat the new American tactics. He'd watched them learn to probe the ground, so he put the trigger on the ground, but the trap in the air. He'd watched them space out their formations, so he made his trap wide enough to hit multiple targets. He was thinking like a hunter, and the jungle was his territory. By mid-1966, booby traps accounted for approximately 11% of American combat deaths in Vietnam and 17% of wounds. These weren't just statistics. They were fathers and sons, brothers and friends. Each one represented a family back home that would receive a telegram, a funeral, a flag, and the psychological toll on survivors was immeasurable. Every patrol became an exercise in controlled fear. Every step was a potential last step. Sergeant Torres, who'd watched Chen fall into Than's pit, developed what would later be recognized as severe PTSD. He started having nightmares, seeing traps that weren't there, freezing up on patrol. By June, he was evacuated to a psychiatric facility in Japan. His war was over, even though he'd never been shot. The trap had claimed 2 victims, the man who fell in it and the man who watched it happen. In July 1966, a captured Viet Cong fighter revealed under interrogation that there was a specific trap builder in the area who was responsible for many of the sophisticated designs. He didn't know the name, just that the fighter was young, methodical, and had studied American tactics extensively. Intelligence officers added this information to their files, but knowing about Thanh and finding him were different things. Thanh, for his part, never thought of himself as particularly deadly. He was simply doing what needed to be done, fighting the only way he could, using the resources available to him, the bamboo that grew everywhere, the rope made from vines, the knowledge passed down from his ancestors. He wasn't trying to kill Americans specifically. He was trying to protect his homeland, to slow down an army that had overwhelming firepower but limited understanding of the terrain. By late 1960s, American forces had documented over 300 different booby trap variations across South Vietnam. Each one represented hours of enemy labor. Each one represented American blood. The traps had become such a significant threat that entire engineering units were dedicated to clearing them. Dogs were trained to detect them. New equipment was developed specifically for dealing with them. The war was evolving. In October 1966, a new piece of equipment arrived in country, the ANPSS-11, a mine detector that could identify buried metal components. It was helpful, but not a solution. Most Viet Cong traps used minimal metal, bamboo stakes, vine rope. The detector was useless against them. What soldiers needed was experience, trained eyes, the ability to read the jungle the way the Viet Cong read it. And that took time that many young soldiers didn't have. Private Robert Johnson arrived in Vietnam in November 1966, 19 years old, from Ohio. He'd gone through booby trap training at the brigade school. He'd learned all the techniques. He was careful, methodical. On his third day in country, during his first patrol, he stepped on a cartridge trap, a single rifle round buried in a bamboo tube with a nail for a firing pin. His weight pushed the cartridge down onto the nail. The round fired up through the sole of his boot, through his foot, and exited through his ankle. The wound was small, but the pain was excruciating, and the psychological damage was permanent. Johnson spent 3 months recovering. He never went back to the field. Some wounds don't heal. Thanh built his last trap in December 1966. It was similar to the design that had caught Chen 10 months earlier, a pit with angled stakes and poisoned points. He placed it carefully, covering it with living grass, making it invisible. 2 days later, he was killed in a firefight 3 kilometers away. He was trying to escape an American patrol when he ran into a clearing and was caught in crossfire. He died quickly. He was 24 years old. He'd built an estimated 70 traps during his 2-year career as a fighter. Those traps had killed or wounded over 40 American soldiers. His body was never identified. He was buried in a mass grave with 6 other Viet Cong fighters. No name, no marker, just another casualty in a war that would claim 3 million lives before it ended. The trap Thanh built before he died was discovered by American engineers on January 3, 1967. They carefully excavated it, photographed it, and added it to the growing database of booby trap designs. By then, the database contained over 500 variations. The sophistication was staggering. Some traps were simple. Others were elaborate mechanical devices that would have impressed any engineer. All of them were deadly. All of them were effective. By 1967, American tactics had evolved significantly. Units no longer moved in single file through suspected areas. They used combined formations with multiple probe teams. Engineers walked ahead with detectors and probes. Infantry provided security. Helicopters flew overhead, looking for signs of disturbed earth or unnatural clearings. It was slow. It was resource-intensive, but it worked. Casualty rates from booby traps dropped from 17% of all wounds in 1966 to 11% in 1967. Progress, measured in lives saved, but the Viet Cong adapted too. They moved traps into populated areas where American forces were less likely to search thoroughly. They placed them in urban environments, in buildings, under roads. The war changed. The traps changed with it. By 1968, during the Tet Offensive, booby traps had largely been superseded by more conventional warfare, but they never went away entirely. Right up until the American withdrawal in 1973, soldiers were still dying to bamboo stakes placed by fighters who'd learned from Than's example. The legacy of the bamboo pit trap extends beyond Vietnam. The lessons learned about improvised explosive devices and booby traps in the jungles of Southeast Asia informed American military doctrine for decades. When U.S. forces encountered IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan, the institutional knowledge from Vietnam proved crucial. The importance of local knowledge, the need for specialized training, the psychological impact of hidden threats. These weren't new problems. They were old problems in new settings. Modern military forces still study Vietnamese booby traps, not because they're likely to encounter identical devices, but because the principles remain relevant. Asymmetric warfare, force multiplication, psychological operations. These concepts, perfected in the jungle with sharpened bamboo and patience, continue to shape how militaries think about guerrilla combat. The men who survived the traps carried the experience with them forever. Chen, who lost his leg to Than's pit in February 1960, spent 40 years dealing with phantom pain and nightmares. He became an advocate for veterans' mental health services, speaking openly about the psychological trauma of combat. He died in 2007, still haunted by the memory of that morning in the jungle when the ground opened beneath him. Torres, who watched Chen fall, struggled with PTSD for decades. He went through multiple treatment programs. Some helped, some didn't. He eventually found peace working with other veterans, sharing his story, helping younger soldiers understand that invisible wounds are just as real as physical ones. He's still alive today, living in Texas, still thinking about that February morning when he learned that war isn't just about bullets and bombs. Martinez, killed by the bamboo whip in May 1966, was buried in his hometown in New Mexico. He was 20 years old. His mother received his medals and his personal effects, and a letter from his commanding officer that said he died serving his country. The letter didn't mention the bamboo stake that had killed him. It didn't need to. The pain was the same regardless of the weapon. Than's family never knew exactly how he died. They received word through the local cadre that he'd been killed in action. There was no body to bury, no grave to visit. After the war ended in 1975, his village erected a memorial to all the fighters who'd died. Than's name was on it, one of hundreds. His father lived until 1989, never knowing that his son had become one of the most effective trap builders in the entire war. That knowledge died with Than in that clearing in December 1966. The trap-building techniques Than developed weren't written down. They were passed orally from fighter to fighter. Some survived, some were lost. After the war, the Vietnamese government collected accounts from veterans, trying to preserve the history of the resistance. A few old fighters mentioned a young man from their village who'd been particularly skilled with bamboo traps, but no one remembered his name. The specifics faded. The principles remained. In 1995, an American veterans group sponsored a trip back to Vietnam. Torres was part of the group. They visited old battlefields, talked to former enemies, tried to find some peace with their experiences. Torres asked about booby traps, about whether anyone remembered the fighters who'd built them. An old Vietnamese man, a former Viet Cong officer, smiled sadly. "We all built traps," he said through a translator. "Every fighter knew how. It was survival. We didn't have bombs or jets. We had bamboo and patience." Torres asked if the man had known anyone particularly skilled at trap building. The old fighter thought for a moment. There was a young man from my village, very clever with his hands. He built traps that even we couldn't spot. He was killed late in 1966. I don't remember his name, but I remember his traps. They saved many lives. Our lives. Torres felt a strange mixture of emotions, anger, respect, sorrow. The man who'd built the trap that cost Chen his leg had probably been the same age as Chen, fighting for the same reasons, protecting his home, doing what he thought was right. War strips away nuance, creates enemies out of people who, in any other circumstance, might have been friends. Torres shook the old fighter's hand. They shared a moment of understanding. Two old men who'd survived a war that had consumed so many. The bamboo pit trap remains one of the most effective guerrilla weapons ever developed, not because it was technologically sophisticated, not because it was expensive or difficult to produce, but because it was simple, adaptable, and perfectly suited to the environment where it was used. It took advantage of psychology as much as physics. It turned the jungle itself into a weapon, and it forced a technologically superior military to slow down, to question every step, to fight not just an enemy force, but the very ground beneath their feet. The statistics tell part of the story. Between 1965 and 1970, 11% of American combat deaths and 17% of wounds were caused by mines and booby traps. In some units, particularly Marines operating in I Corps in 1965, that number reached 70%. Thousands of young men killed or maimed by devices that cost almost nothing to build, but were devastatingly effective to encounter. But statistics don't capture the full impact. The fear, the paranoia, the way every patrol became an exercise in controlled terror, the way soldiers looked at peaceful jungle trails and saw death, the way the ground itself became the enemy. These psychological effects multiplied the trap's tactical value far beyond their actual casualty rates. Military analysts studying the Vietnam War have concluded that the booby trap campaign was one of the most successful aspects of the Viet Cong strategy. It didn't win the war. Nothing the Viet Cong did alone could have done that. But it made the war longer, harder, and more psychologically damaging for American forces. It demonstrated that even a technologically primitive enemy could effectively contest a modern military if they understood their terrain and fought intelligently. The lessons from Vietnam influenced how the U.S. military approached later conflicts. The emphasis on counterinsurgency training, the development of specialized equipment for detecting improvised explosive devices, the recognition that in guerrilla warfare, the civilian population and the terrain matter as much as firepower. These weren't new insights. They'd been learned and relearned throughout military history. But Vietnam drove them home with particular force. Today, the Cu Chi tunnels near Ho Chi Minh City contain a museum dedicated to the Vietnamese resistance. Among the displays are reconstructed booby traps. Tourists, mostly Western, walk through carefully marked paths, looking at the pits and stakes and mechanical triggers that killed so many soldiers. There's something surreal about seeing these devices rendered safe and educational, about standing beside a punji pit and knowing that 50 years ago, stepping on that spot would have meant death or mutilation. The museum doesn't glorify the traps. It doesn't need to. Their effectiveness speaks for itself. The displays are matter of fact. This is what we built. This is how it worked. This is what happened when you stepped on it. There's a grim honesty to the presentation. War is terrible. These devices were terrible, but they were necessary. Or at least, That's what the fighters believed. American veterans visiting the museum have mixed reactions. Some are angry. These weapons violated the rules of war, targeted indiscriminately, caused unnecessary suffering. Others are more philosophical. We were in their country. They used what they had. We would have done the same. And some just stand quietly, looking at the displays, remembering friends who didn't come home. The traps are historical artifacts now, but the memories are still fresh. Nguyen Van Thanh never became famous. His name appears in no history books. There are no monuments to his trap-building skills. He was a footnote in a war full of footnotes. But his work influenced how that war was fought. His innovations forced American units to change tactics. His patience and precision cost lives and resources far out of proportion to his individual contribution. In his own small way, he shaped history. That's how wars are really won or lost. Not in the grand battles that make the history books, but in 1,000 small engagements, 1,000 innovations, 1,000 acts of courage or desperation or simple survival. Thanh building traps in the jungle, Chen probing carefully through elephant grass, Torres trying to save his friend, Martinez stepping over a log. Each moment mattered. Each decision had consequences that rippled outward. The bamboo pit trap was banned by international convention after the war. Protocol 2 of the 1980 Convention on certain conventional weapons specifically prohibits booby traps designed to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. The protocol includes detailed provisions about what constitutes a legal defensive weapon versus an illegal trap. But enforcement is difficult, and in conflicts around the world, similar devices continue to appear. The technology is too simple to ban effectively. You can't regulate bamboo and rope. What you can do is remember. Remember what these weapons cost. Remember the young men on both sides who built them, encountered them, survived them, or died from them. Remember that war creates terrible choices. Remember that every innovation in killing has a human cost. David Chen, the private who fell into Than's trap in February 1960X, lived the rest of his life with a prosthetic leg. He married, had children, built a career as an accountant. He rarely talked about Vietnam, but every morning when he woke up and looked at where his left leg should have been, he remembered. Every time the weather changed and his stump ached, he remembered. Every time he heard a helicopter, he remembered that medevac flight and the overwhelming certainty that he was going to die in that jungle. He didn't hate Than. He never knew Than's name. Never learned anything about the man who'd built the trap that changed his life. But in his mind, over decades, he'd constructed an image, a young Vietnamese man, probably a farmer, probably scared, probably fighting for the same reasons Chen had been fighting, protecting his home, doing what he was told, trying to survive. In 2003, Chen traveled back to Vietnam, not with a veterans group, just him and his wife. Tourism, closure, something. They visited Chu Lai, or what had been Chu Lai. The American base was long gone. The area was farmland again. Rice paddies and small villages, peaceful, beautiful, hard to imagine it had been a war zone. Chen hired a guide and tried to find the place where he'd been wounded. He had coordinates from the after-action report he'd requested from the National Archives. But the jungle had changed in 40 years. What had been a trail was now a village road. What had been a clearing was now someone's farm. He couldn't find the exact spot. Maybe that was better. They stayed in the area for 3 days. Chen talked to locals through his guide about the war. Most remembered it. Many had fought. An old man mentioned that his nephew had been killed near here in 1966. December, fighting Americans. Chen did the math. Same time frame, different people, same war, same tragedy. On the last day, Chen stood at the edge of a rice paddy and looked out across the green fields. Somewhere in this area, he'd lost his leg. Somewhere near here, a young Vietnamese man had built a trap that changed both their lives. That young man was probably dead now. Almost certainly dead. And Chen was alive, and standing here watching farmers work the land. It all seemed senseless. The Itaba, war, the traps, the fear and pain and death. What had it accomplished? What had any of it meant? These are questions veterans ask themselves, questions that don't have good answers. Chen flew home the next day. He never went back. But the trip had given him something, not closure exactly, but perspective. The war was over. Life continued. The jungle had healed. Maybe people could too. Nguyen Van Thanh died decades ago. David Chen died in 2007. Michael Torres is still alive, but diminished by age and the weight of memories. The war that consumed them is increasingly distant. The veterans are dying. The generation that fought is passing away. Soon there will be no one left who remembers what those booby traps felt like to encounter. No one who can describe the specific fear of walking point through elephant grass in hostile territory. But the lessons remain. Written in military doctrine, taught in officer training courses, studied by engineers and strategists. The bamboo pit trap, in all its variations, became a case study in asymmetric warfare, in how a weaker force can effectively contest a stronger one, in how local knowledge and creativity can offset technological disadvantage. Modern soldiers encountering IEDs in Iraq or Afghanistan were facing the same fundamental challenge their predecessors faced in Vietnam. An enemy who used the terrain, who built deadly devices from common materials, who studied their movements and adapted faster than they could counter. The weapons evolved, the environments changed, but the tactical principles remained constant. The Vietnamese called it a people's war. Everyone contributed. Farmers built traps, women transported supplies, children served as lookouts. The entire population became part of the resistance. This made conventional military operations nearly impossible. How do you fight an enemy when every civilian might be a fighter, when every rice paddy might conceal a tunnel, when every trail might be trapped? You can't, not effectively. Not without becoming monsters yourself. The Americans learned this slowly and at terrible cost. By the time they'd figured out effective counter-tactics, public support for the war had eroded. The strategic situation had shifted. The path toward withdrawal was clear. The booby traps didn't win the war, but they contributed to the American decision to leave. They were part of a larger strategy of attrition. Make the war too costly, too painful, too long. Eventually, they'll go home. And eventually, they did. In 2024, there are still booby traps in the Vietnamese jungle. Unexploded ordnance from both sides. Old trap pits that haven't completely eroded. Occasionally, someone stumbles across one. Usually locals who know to be careful. Sometimes tourists who wander off marked trails. The war ended 50 years ago, but it's not really over. Not for the land. Not for the people who live with the scars. The story of Nguyen Van Thanh and David Chen is really the story of thousands of similar encounters. Names changed, circumstances varied, but the fundamental narrative was the same. Young men fighting a war they didn't fully understand, using the tools available to them, trying to survive, trying to win, trying to go home. Thanh succeeded at 2 of those 3. He fought well. He built effective traps. He died in combat. He never went home. Chen survived, but at a cost that shaped the rest of his life. Both men were brave. Both men did their duty as they understood it. Both men paid for a war that shouldn't have happened. History remembers the generals and politicians, but it was built by the Thans and Chens, the soldiers in the jungle, the ones who faced the actual consequences of strategic decisions made in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. The bamboo pit trap is a simple weapon. Bamboo stakes, a hole in the ground, basic physics. But it represented something larger, the determination of a people fighting for their homeland, the resourcefulness of fighters who refused to accept defeat despite overwhelming odds, the brutality of a war where the ground itself became weaponized, and the cost, measured in young lives destroyed, of conflicts that pit technology against will, and find that will often wins. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.